September 6, 1976. The quiet coastal city of Hakodate, Japan, is about to witness something that shouldn't exist. A massive, twin-tailed beast, the MiG-25 Foxbat, tears through the clouds. It's the Soviet Union's most terrifying secret, a machine the Pentagon calls the Ghost of the East. It's supposed to be patrolling the frozen borders of Siberia. Instead, it's currently skimming the rooftops of Japanese suburbs at nearly 500 miles per hour. The pilot, Lieutenant Viktor Belenko, isn't looking for a dogfight. He's looking for a runway. Any runway. His fuel gauge is sitting on dead zero. The 20-ton steel monster is no longer a fighter jet. It's a high-speed glider falling out of the sky. The MiG slams onto the civilian runway of Hakodate Airport, narrowly missing a Boeing 727 filled with terrified passengers. It skids 200 feet past the tarmac, plowing into the dirt, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. Silence returns, but only for a second. Belenko throws open the canopy. He climbs out, his flight suit soaked in sweat. As stunned airport workers approach, he pulls his service pistol and fires a single shot into the air. "Stay back," he shouts in broken English. "I am a Soviet pilot. I want asylum. I want to go to the United States." In that moment, the Cold War didn't just heat up. It shattered. This wasn't just a defection. It was a $2 billion spear driven directly into the heart of the Kremlin. But why did he do it? How did a top-tier Soviet elite slip through the world's most advanced radar net alone? And more importantly, what did the CIA find when they finally ripped this super weapon apart piece by piece? The truth was far more shocking than anyone in Washington ever imagined. To understand why Belenko's landing was a global earthquake, we have to go back to the early 70s. For years, the MiG-25, codenamed Foxbat by NATO, was the monster under the bed for every Western general. American satellites had spotted this thing on Soviet runways, and it looked like a nightmare. It had massive wings, 2 gargantuan engines, and a tail section that screamed unbeatable maneuverability. The Pentagon's best analysts were panicking. They assumed the USSR had somehow leapfrogged Western technology. They thought the Foxbat was a super fighter that could outfly, outclimb, and outshoot anything in the US arsenal. Then came March 1971. An Israeli radar operator blinked in disbelief. A Soviet MiG-25, flying over the Sinai Peninsula, was clocked at a staggering Mach 3.2. That is over 3 times the speed of sound. To put that in perspective, when Israeli F-4 Phantoms tried to intercept it, the MiG simply accelerated and left them in the dust, as if they were standing still. The US military's response was a desperate, multi-billion-dollar scramble. This fear, this Foxbat panic, is literally the reason the F-15 Eagle exists. The United States designed their premier air superiority fighter specifically to beat the Phantom specifications of a jet they had never actually touched. But there was a catch. American engineers were building the F-15 using the most expensive materials on Earth, titanium and advanced composites. They assumed the Soviets were doing the same. They assumed the MiG-25 was a masterpiece of precision engineering, a digital god in a world of analog pilots. They were preparing for a war against a god, but they were about to find out they were actually dealing with a very different kind of beast. Little did the CIA know, the Mach 3.2 speed record they saw on radar wasn't a display of power. It was a cry of agony. The MiG's engines were literally melting themselves to stay in the air. But Belenko knew something the Americans didn't. He knew the MiG-25 wasn't just a plane, it was a cage, and he was about to hand them the keys. To the world, Viktor Belenko was an elite, a top-tier pilot handpicked to fly the most expensive weapon in the Soviet arsenal. But inside the gates of the Chuguyevka airbase, the reality was a slow-motion nightmare. The Soviet Union was a superpower on paper, but a third-world country in the barracks. Belenko watched as his fellow officers lived in filth. Food was scarce. Corruption was the only thing that functioned. While the Kremlin spent billions on Mach 3 interceptors, they couldn't provide their pilots with decent housing or even enough meat for dinner. Here's a detail the West never knew. The MiG-25 didn't just run on fuel. Its massive radar system required cooling. And for that, the Soviets used 200 liters of pure, high-grade grain alcohol. In a base where hope was dead, that alcohol became the local currency. Pilots and mechanics would drain the spirit from the jets to get drunk, or to trade it for a loaf of bread or a pair of boots. They called the MiG-25 the flying restaurant. Belenko, a man of discipline and order, watched his Air Force literally drinking itself to death. But it wasn't just the poverty, it was the lies. Belenko was a seeker of truth in a system built on deception. He saw the propaganda posters of a Soviet utopia while looking out his window at bread lines. He realized that the enemies he was told to hate, the Americans, lived in a world where freedom of thought wasn't a crime. He didn't just want a better car or a bigger house. He wanted to be a man again, not a cog in a rusting machine. By mid-1976, the decision was made. He would leave. But he knew the KGB watched everyone. His wife, his child, his friends. Everyone was a potential informant. He had to become a ghost before he could become a defector. He spent months pretending to be the most loyal, most boring pilot in the regiment. He was so good at it that nobody noticed when he started studying the fuel charts of the Sea of Japan with obsessive detail. The date was set, September 6th. But Belenko didn't just need a plane. He needed a miracle. Because the moment he turned his nose toward Japan, he wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a target. And the Soviet air defense had a very simple order for rogue pilots. Do not let them land. At any cost. September 6th, 1976, 12:50 p.m. Viktor Belenko climbs into the cockpit of Red 7, his assigned MiG-25. To the ground crew, it's just another training sortie. But for Belenko, this is the last time his boots will ever touch Soviet soil. He taxis to the runway. The afterburners ignite with a roar that shakes the very foundations of the airbase. Within seconds, he is airborne, climbing into the Siberian mist. He follows the formation for exactly 15 minutes. Then, at the edge of the Soviet coastline, he sees his window. Engine trouble, he radios in a calm, flat voice, dropping out of formation. Instead of circling back, Belenko dives. He doesn't just descend, he plunges toward the waves. He knows the Soviet radar net is like a wall, but every wall has a gap at the bottom. He levels out at just 150 feet above the Sea of Japan. At this altitude, the salt spray from the waves is literally hitting his canopy. One mistake, one twitch of the hand, and the fastest jet in the world becomes a high-speed coffin. He is flying so low that the Soviet search radars can't distinguish his jet from the crests of the waves. He is a ghost. But being invisible isn't enough. He needs speed. Belenko hammers the throttle into full afterburner. The MiG-25 was built for this. It's not a scalpel, it's a sledgehammer. He crosses the Mach 1 barrier, then Mach 2. The air friction is so intense, the cockpit glass becomes hot to the touch. Back at the base, the Soviet commanders realize Red 7 hasn't crashed. It's moving, fast, and it's heading the wrong way. The order is screamed over the radio. Scramble all interceptors! Find him! Shoot him down! Do not let that aircraft reach international airspace. Belenko looks at his radar. Multiple blips appear behind him. His own comrades are now his hunters. They are closing the gap. He pushes the engines even harder, entering a danger zone, where the turbines start to disintegrate from the heat. Then, the ultimate nightmare happens. The fuel warning light flickers. The MiG-25 consumes fuel like a forest fire. By flying at maximum speed at sea level, where the air is thick and heavy, he has burned through twice as much fuel as he planned. Japan is still miles away. His hunters are behind him, and his engines are beginning to cough. He is 10 minutes from either the greatest intelligence heist in history or a fiery death in the dark waters of the Pacific. While Belenko was fighting for his life in the cockpit, the Japanese self-defense forces were having a collective heart attack. Japan's radar network, built with the best American technology, was supposed to be a great wall of silicon. But the MiG-25 was doing something they weren't prepared for. By flying at wave-top level, Belenko was literally under their radar. When he finally had to climb to find an airport, he popped up on their screens like a phantom. 2 Japanese F-4 Phantoms scrambled to intercept him, but it was like trying to catch a bullet with a butterfly net. By the time they reached his last known coordinates, Belenko had already disappeared back into the clouds. He was playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek with an entire nation's military. When the massive gray jet finally slammed down onto the civilian runway at Hakodate, the Japanese authorities didn't know whether to offer him tea or start a war. They had just allowed a nuclear-capable Soviet interceptor to land in the middle of a commercial airport without a single shot being fired. Within 2 hours, the Hakodate standoff became the center of the world. Moscow was humiliated, and a humiliated bear is a dangerous one. The Kremlin sent an immediate, blistering message to Tokyo. Return the pilot and the aircraft immediately. Any attempt to touch the aircraft will be considered an act of aggression against the Soviet Union. Soviet warships began moving toward Japanese waters. Their message was clear: give it back or we take it back. But in Washington, the mood was the polar opposite of Moscow's. The CIA directors couldn't believe their luck. This was the holy grail of the Cold War. They didn't just want the pilot. They wanted to strip that jet down to the last bolt. Japan was caught in a terrifying Mexican standoff. If they handed it to the Americans, they risked a direct military conflict with the USSR. If they gave it back to Moscow, they would betray their greatest ally. For 48 hours, the world held its breath. Belenko sat in a small, guarded room, knowing that if Japan blinked, he would be handed back to a firing squad. But then, the Japanese Prime Minister made a phone call that changed everything. He didn't send the plane back. Instead, he ordered a massive canvas tent to be built over the MiG-25 and invited a very specific group of tourists from Ohio to bring their toolboxes. When the American team from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base finally got their hands on the MiG-25, they expected to find a spaceship. They brought sophisticated sensors to measure exotic titanium alloys and high-speed microprocessors. But as they turned the first bolts, the room went silent. "It's steel," one engineer whispered. The Americans were floored. In the West, building a Mach 3 plane out of steel was considered impossible. It's too heavy. The US spent a fortune developing titanium for the SR-71 Blackbird. But the Soviets? They didn't have the luxury of expensive materials. So, they used nickel steel and welded it together, by hand. In some places, the welding was so crude it looked like a high school shop project. The rivets were jagged, not flush with the skin. To an American eye, it looked like a flying tractor. Then, they opened the nose cone to inspect the radar. They expected to see the world's most advanced transistors. Instead, they found vacuum tubes. In 1976, while the West was entering the age of the microchip, the Soviet superweapon was running on the same technology found in your grandmother's 1950s radio. The Americans almost laughed. Was this the ghost of the East they had been fearing for a decade? But then, one senior analyst stopped laughing. He looked at the massive glass tubes and realized the brutal genius of the Soviet design. These aren't obsolete, he realized. They're nuclear-proof. Vacuum tubes are immune to the electromagnetic pulse, EMP, of a nuclear blast. While a US F-15's sensitive microelectronics would fry and die in a nuclear exchange, the MiG-25 would keep flying, its primitive radar still searching for targets in a world of dead electronics. But there was one more surprise waiting for them in the engines. The Americans calculated the thrust of the massive Tumansky R-15S and realized something terrifying. The MiG-25 wasn't fast because it was efficient. It was fast because it was a suicide machine. If the pilot ever pushed it to the Mach 3.2 they saw on radar, the engines wouldn't just overheat. They would literally act as a vacuum, sucking their own internal components into the combustion chamber and melting into a solid block of metal. Belenko hadn't flown a superplane. He had flown a rocket that was trying to eat itself. After 60 days of intensive study, Japan did something that infuriated the Kremlin one last time. They crated the MiG-25 and shipped it back to the Soviet Union. But it wasn't a grand return. It was returned in pieces, literally. The Americans and Japanese had disassembled every single component. When the Soviet technicians opened the crates, they found a note from the Japanese government demanding $40,000 for shipping and airport damage. The Foxbat was no longer a ghost. Its secrets were laid bare. The US realized they didn't need a super interceptor to beat it. They just needed to exploit its massive heat signature and lack of maneuverability. The Foxbat panic was over. As for Viktor Belenko, he got what he wanted. He was granted asylum by President Jimmy Carter. He became an American citizen, worked as an aerospace consultant, and finally lived in a world where he could speak his mind without looking over his shoulder. He saw the supermarkets filled with food, the freedom of the press, and the dignity of the individual, everything he had dreamed of in the gray barracks of Chuguyevka. But freedom is never free. The Soviet government, unable to reach Belenko, took their revenge on the only people he had left behind. His wife and son were kept under constant surveillance, used as pawns in a propaganda war. They were forced to go on television and beg him to come home, claiming he had been kidnapped. Belenko knew the truth. He knew that if he ever went back, he would be executed, and his family would still suffer. He chose to stay. He remarried in America, started a new life, but carried the weight of that silence for the rest of his days. He never saw his Russian family again. He died in 2023, a man who had changed history, but a man who lived with a hole in his heart that no amount of Western luxury could fill. Viktor Belenko didn't just steal a jet. He proved that the most powerful weapon a superpower possesses isn't a Mach 3 interceptor or a nuclear warhead. It's the human desire for liberty. A system that builds super weapons but starves its people will eventually see its best and brightest fly toward the horizon, looking for a place where they can finally breathe. The MiG-25 is now a relic in museums, but the story of the man who flew it into the unknown reminds us. In the chess game of empires, a single pawn can change the world, if they are brave enough to make the ultimate move. What do you think? Was Belenko a hero who exposed a failing system, or a traitor who abandoned his family for a dream? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the secrets of the Cold War, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're just getting started.